Well, we're back, as uh, Johnny Carson used to say. So, anyway, I thought it occurred to me to in the 3 minute interim there that there was a really beautifully written piece in the Boston Globe that I just wanted to mention to everybody because I think it was really worth it. So, uh, just about a month ago, or a month or so ago, we lost former city councilor Bernie Goldberg. Now, Bernie and his twin brother, William Goldberg, were kind of regulars, lawyers who worked out of Central Square. And it was this wonderful article that appeared in the Boston Globe on December 18th about one of my personal favorite eateries in all of Cambridge, and should be yours too, called Brookline Lunch, which was taken over some years ago by Jamal and Manal Abu Rabia, and it's the best place for breakfast anywhere in the universe, as far as I'm concerned. And Manal when I used to go there regularly, I never even had to make an order. I would just walk in, she'd bring me my breakfast. She knew what I wanted. I haven't been back in a long, long time, but it was a great place. So I didn't know that there was this wonderful relationship between Bernie Goldberg and the Goldberg brothers and the family. And the Boston Globe article is just a delight. It basically gives a history about how actually Bernie was pivotal in actually suggesting to them that they should take over the business there from the previous owners some years ago. I had no idea that they went back this far, and with this incredible friendship between them. And again, the fact that it was a Palestinian family and a Jewish lawyer kind of made the story particularly spectacular, I'd have to say. But it was it's a nice delight when you can go open up a newspaper and actually see three faces, all of whom are three of the people you really like. I mean, I didn't know Bernie very well, but we did talk in Central Square a number of times. But anyway, it's a great, great story. If you haven't seen it, I certainly recommend that you find a way to take a look at that because it really is worth it. All right. Now, another thing I want to talk about a little bit was the Charter Review Committee. All right. So I think I'll do another very, very brief share screen before I just sort of talk about it here. But so, I've certainly been following the process of this Charter Review Committee now since its inception. Again, I won't run from the fact that I wanted to be on that committee and was not chosen because it was a political matter. And there's no denying that, no matter what anybody might say. But I've been making it as easy as possible because can't necessarily say that they organize a lot of their meeting materials very well, but I've tried my best to actually organize them. So they began meeting in August of 2022. Had an extraordinarily slow start. They really stumbled out of the starting gates, but then eventually kind of got into a bit of a stride. And then there were indications that they were leaning towards certain outcomes, but then somehow late this past year, the tide kind of turned and they started moving into a somewhat more curious, shall we say, direction. So, and again, anyway, there's not a whole lot to see there. I'm just going to speak to this a little bit, but um, I participated in some of the meetings, but of course, it was all done in Zoom. And again, don't get me going on the faultiness of this Zoom-based world. Public meetings simply do not operate in the same way when they're all done in this sort of isolation of Zoom. Now, I'm doing this program here in Zoom, so it's not like I'm opposed to Zoom. I teach classes in Zoom, and I have a lot of respect for and appreciation for the fact that people can access meetings, class meetings or public meetings, in ways that they couldn't previously do. But the default option for all public meetings should still be in person, where you can actually see people's expressions and you can have side conversations and participants can actually talk to each other, which is something that is impossible in the way things are configured. It's almost like a divide and conquer strategy. Keep the public as divided and as dissociated from the process as possible. And again, I was promised by the chair of the committee in the early meetings that they would eventually transition away from purely remote meetings, and it never happened. I suppose there's a great comfort in just basically not having to worry about those nasty members of the public actually talking to each other. So anyway, in the end, and it's not over because though they were originally supposed to be finished in June of 2023, they asked for a 6 months extension and was granted that by the city council. And then, sort of like some of my students at the 11th hour, they were still scrambling to finish the job, before they turned in their homework. And then in the end, they had to ask for yet another extension. Of course, they weren't going to ask for a long extension this time because they probably wouldn't have gotten it. But they got another 1 month extension, presumably just to finish up the report. So presumably, at least they promised that the last actual votes on everything would be completed at their December 19th meeting, which I reviewed just today because I just didn't have a chance because I had exams to grade. So anyway, in the end, and again, we'll talk, there's going to be a lot more talk about this as we head into the rest of this year up at the city council, and hopefully the city council will come up with a good process so that the public can review the charter review recommendations. Because ultimately the charter review committee's recommendations are nothing but that. They are just recommendations, and even some of their recommendations were not full-blown recommendations because they couldn't come up with the necessary supermajority vote that they had agreed upon in order to call something an actual recommendation. Perhaps the single most significant part of this was the basic questions about the basic form of government. Okay, so it wasn't like they were going to go back to town meeting or anything like that, but in the end, it was basically a modified. There's a city council, city manager form of government, which is more or less what we have today, with some modifications, perhaps, as is in the current planning charter, or they can move toward a so-called strong mayor system, where the mayor becomes the appointing authority and essentially the CEO for city government. They rolled into that an idea about a chief financial, financial person, so that the directly elected mayor under this proposal would not necessarily be presumed to have great skills as a financial manager. So they would have an additional structure folded into the government system. But they would, of course, still have a city council. But I think anybody who really understands this is that you move to a strong mayor, you end up with a city council that's largely, useless. I mean, again, and by the way, I don't believe the city council currently is useless. I think they are problematic sometimes, but I don't think they're useless, and I think they have real power. You make it a strong mayor, mayor calls the shots, city council is pretty secondary. In fact, even city council elections become almost forgotten little things, especially if they're all at large. It's different if you have district councilors where you can make like a little issue locally in order to who's going to represent District 7 or something like that. But we have no districts in Cambridge, so ultimately, if they were to go to a strong mayor system, the councilors would essentially be nothing. At least that's my personal point of view. Anyway, that was put to a vote. What do you want to do? And some months ago, it was pretty clear that they were still pretty strongly supportive of a city manager form of government. But in the end, the tide had turned, and they were moving toward a strong mayor. They took a vote. There were 15 members of the committee. 8 actually voted in favor of a strong mayor form of government, and 7 against. And in a rather despicable moment, one of the members actually demanded that one of the other committee members explain their vote, like, why didn't you vote like us, like you were supposed to? And that was, fortunately, the chair was smart enough to say, you can't do that. So that put an end to that ridiculousness. But in the end, there was only an 8-7 vote, and they had all agreed that you had to have a 2/3 majority to actually be a recommendation. So you're going to basically have narratives about both ideas will be a part of the recommendations, but there will be no actual formal recommendation to change the form of government. But let's be clear, it's all in the city council's hands anyway. They could take every single one of the recommendations, throw them away, and replace them with whatever the heck they want, really. And then ultimately it is shipped to the state legislature just to see if it meets the necessary requirements, and then it would come back to the voters eventually. That's basically the way it works. But just to give a quick list of some of the proposals that have either been, are going to be recommendations or at least part of the narrative, or at least were part of the process. Again, personally, I still have questions about this committee, how the committee was formed in the first place. I think it was a violation of the city charter, which was a great irony to have a charter review committee created in violation of the city charter. But hey, that's me. And again, there was a lot of sort of, I would call it a racial tone in the early goings, and some serious griping, and I would argue that there was pretty clear indications of some of the political influence of the ad hoc committee of 4 city councilors, and just in terms of who was selected for this committee. But that said, it's 15 people. They had to do their job. Okay. But so they're going to have no absolute recommendation about city manager versus strong mayor. So I guess by default, we're probably leaning more towards city manager form of government. But I hope that as they review the review, that they don't just focus exclusively on that, because there are some other things that are significant. One thing I think it was absolutely necessary was basically a clean reformatting of the whole charter. Right now, the city charter of Cambridge is, I don't know, about 16 or 17 provisions, clauses of Chapter 43 of the Massachusetts General Law, and which reference another 50 clauses. So put it all into one document, and so they're going to do that. There's no question about that. That was one of their very first votes, is to agree to do that. But they're going to have issues about lowering the voting age as one of the proposals. I forget whether they had the necessary 2/3 vote to want to lower the voting age to 16, even lower the age for candidates to run. And again, I think neither of those proposals are going to be received well at the state legislature, and I'm not sure yet if the state legislature doesn't like one part of the whole proposal, whether they can basically go thumbs down to the whole suggestion. I don't know, but anyway, that's something that'll be part of it. They want to give non-citizen voting rights. Again, there was a time you might have convinced me of that, for at least for school committee. I'm not on board on that at all anymore, and I don't think the state legislature is going to be particularly cool to that idea either. They discussed things such as what should the length of term be. There was always this lingering reality, which is that if you have a 1-year term like they had 100 years ago, that there's no need for a recall, because the next election will come around before you even had a chance to do it, or the chance to kick somebody out. 2-year terms probably still mostly viewed as short enough so that the recall is the next election. But if you were to move toward things like 4-year terms, you almost have to have some kind of a recall provision, because if you turned out you got a real problematic elected person, and 6 months in and you're stuck with them, the public does need to have some provision. So, but for the most part, I think they're sticking with the 2-year terms. I don't remember offhand whether they were, because I know there were some members of the school committee wanted the luxury of not having to run it very frequently for re-election. So I think they wanted 4-year terms, but I don't know that they got it. Apparently everybody still agrees in keeping at-large proportional representation elections, so no districts, even though there was some back and forth about that early on. Perhaps the single most interesting proposal is actually something I suggested early on too, which was to have, except my perspective is quite different than theirs, which was, back in the days before 1846 when we had town meeting, and then afterwards when we had wards actually served a function as sort of a more localized way in which people can kind of get together within a ward and sort of hash out some things. When the planning charter was established, it obliterated the significance of the wards. So, there's no neighborhood basis for anything anymore. So I thought, well, maybe they should create some alternative ways of having citizens get together to kind of percolate ideas that go to the city council with their have some sort of legitimacy of perhaps being elected people, even if nothing they say is binding. Anyway, this did grow into something called citizen assemblies that they still have not worked. They have not worked out the details. I think they'll largely leave that to the city council to work some of that out. What they want to be chosen, at least one per year, I believe is what they said, chosen by the city council is I think what they're leaning toward now. And they would not have no binding authority, which is appropriate. But they want to select them not exactly by lottery, but basically having it be representative of various ethnicities and whatever. And I thought, well, who's going to make those determinations? How is that going to work? At least with a PR election, an actual election, people can kind of vote based on religious, racial, gender lines, and whatever. It's their call. What are you going to do? You leave that to a bureaucrat or a bunch of city council committee to do that now? So I think they've kind of screwed this up. But they also want to have citizen petitions, which would force city councilors to have a hearing and a vote. I think that's a good improvement because right now, I can give you examples where almost 1,000 signatures on a petition, it just gets placed on file and might as well have been thrown in a wastebasket. So at least to force a hearing. You can find some of the early charters, proposed charters over the history of Cambridge that actually included provisions like that. So I think it's a good idea. They also want to have things where you can actually have the citizens propose almost like an initiative petition. I could propose an ordinance. You require significantly more signatures, presumably, to do that. But then, as long as it meets legal muster via the city solicitor, the city council could basically vote, to go along with it. And if they veto it, then they would just gather up, just like it's done with the initiative petition process in the state, gather additional signatures and enforce it onto a ballot so that the voters could vote on things. So I'm kind of mixed feelings about that. I kind of would love to believe that there's a reason we have elected representatives, even though certainly over the last few years, I've questioned their representativeness and their willingness to actually listen to people. But that's a perception, and I could be wrong, and I'm sure other people feel very differently about it. One of the more interesting things about the Charter Review Committee in the late going, it was really obvious that there were certain political organizers who were getting to certain members, or maybe those members of the Charter Review Committee were part of those organizations, and they were trying to force certain issues at the end. So, for example, there had been a proposal by Councilor Zondervan this past year, who wanted to make the Police Review Advisory Board an elected body. That was defeated on a 1-8 vote. So in other words, city councils were not interested. Yet, in the next to last meeting of the Charter Review Committee, one of the more problematic members of the committee introduces it at the last minute, and they said, and finally got shot down and said, well, you can't just pull that out at 11:30 p.m. and say, let's stick that in the charter here, So that went away. But it was interesting how right to the very last, there was some of the members of the committee were acting more like lobbyists, basically trying to force certain things through, whether they were selected or not. I don't know there was one proposal that was discussed to make a distinction in city council orders. Right now we have orders and resolutions. Resolutions are largely just ceremonial things. Congratulations, happy birthday, condolences, etc., etc. But city council orders, really, we think of them as policy orders. They tend to be policy directives to the city manager. But a policy directive is not the same as a mandatory requirement that you must, Mr. City Manager, you must do this. It's more like, this is the will of the council. We really wish you would do this. And if you're going to be a real pain in the ass and not do anything, we could fire you because you do serve at our pleasure. And that is true. But they do call that the nuclear option. So anyway, one of the proposals that was floated, and I don't know for sure where it ended up, was to have basically two different types of policy orders. One which is sort of like a, Mr. Manager, this is what we're thinking, and we want you to do something, versus more of a mandatory one where, Mr. Manager, we're telling you got to do this, and you just better tell us how. And I think that's kind of an overreach. I think because ultimately there are good reasons why a manager, as a manager, says we really can't do that. I can't just drop $1 billion on building, you know, um, you know, kink stables, in every square of the city. So um, even if the city council says so, ultimately, if they want to fire the manager, they can do that, but then the voters can fire the council. So, anyways, I'm not quite sure where that goes, but anyway, whatever government operations committee or ad hoc committee is formed of city councils, and be nice if they could include some of the members of the public, but we'll see. If they're open to that. Certainly the previous council didn't much care what the public thought, so but hope springs eternal that maybe the current council will, and we'll see where it goes. So anyway, I didn't want to, largely this just would take me hours to really do it. But one of the things that I thought I might just sort of wrap things up with here tonight is a little bit of a discussion of what was, sort of what's been going on over the last year or so. So I'm going to do something here, and again, I'm not going to keep this as a script, but one of the things I do is I sort of follow city council business from week to week to week is, afterwards when I'm sort of saying, how many policy orders, congratulatory resolutions, I make a little note. I just extract from the city council agenda some of the more significant things that they do. So, again, and this would be far too voluminous to walk through step by step by step. It would take me forever, but if there's a question about, did the city council of 2022 to 23 accomplish anything? And the answer is yes. And I will say, not that it was done in the best way, in my opinion, but I think it was done pretty well, is they did have the responsibility of doing one of the most important things city council does, which is selecting a city manager, selecting a city clerk, and selecting a city auditor. So the role of the city auditor is not quite the same as it was in 1940, but they did that, and they did it kind of with a very, very rapid turnaround, in the early part of last year, and it culminated, really over the course of just 6 months, which is for these sorts of things is actually pretty spectacularly fast, with the selection of a city manager, as well as a city clerk and a city auditor, right? So, so Yan Huang became city manager, Diane LeBlanc, city clerk, and Joseph McCann as city auditor, replacing Louis DePasquale, Don Lopez, and Jim Monagle. So that was pretty good. That's kind of the bottom line for city government. But again, I won't. I think what I'll do is you can check out the webpage yourself if you want to. But just to sort of quickly stomp through a few of these things. So January of 2022, when Christine Elo was selected as police commissioner, which was good, we had this one council order came that was kind of ridiculous about wanting to repurpose the golf course, or at least portion of the golf course. And that actually lingered all the way through just a couple of months ago, with them still trying to find demographics of who's the golf course. It was the very predictable Cambridge nonsense of saying, well, this is just for upper crust aristocratic people, the only ones who go golfing, which is absolutely false. Some people wanted to put in housing on portions of the golf course. I don't know. It was just ridiculous. Ultimately, they did eliminate parking minimums, sort of citywide, which was, I think, kind of a significant change. I think I might have done it a little bit differently, but it was big. There was, and again, I'm reminded of what Bob Healy said when the city council was gifted the Foundry building. He said, this is going to be a problem, because he understood that everybody would now be fighting over what happens with it. So we had a windfall in the form of ARPA funds, resulting from COVID. And then they fought over how are we going to hand out the money. So in the end, they did this thing called Cambridge Rise with $22 million of which, and basically we were able to use federal funds in a way that would have been a violation of state law to just hand it out to individuals, but they chose to do that. Personally, I think that was not a good idea, but hey, elections are elections, and it helps you get elected when you hand out money. So again, I'm not a big fan of political patronage in any form, whether it's in that form or whether it's handing out contracts to some group that calls itself Cambridge Heart and promises you the world, even if it delivers nothing. There were a lot of little itty bitty things along the way. There was a lot of kerfuffle over whether Memorial Drive should remain closed over Saturday all the way, Saturday morning through Sunday evening. And then that led to suggestions that, state representatives were obstructing our goals to do that. There were whole neighborhoods in Riverside who were not happy with a lot of these decisions, and they were being diminished by activists in various ways. Anyway, that's a minor sort of thing, I suppose, in the big grand scheme of things. Some of the other rather large things I think was focused on, which really culminated this year, had to do with the modifications of the Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, better known as BUDO, where I think it was somewhat of a theatrical thing. They wanted to move up the state deadlines to meet those standards by 2050 to 2035. That turned into a big fight. And then it turned into a lot of people who lived in residential buildings saying, wait, you're going to impoverish us if you force this. So eventually they made modifications, moved up the deadline to 2035, but they exempted some of the residential buildings, which gave a huge sigh of relief to a lot of the residential property owners. So, and then right up until the bell in December, there were still efforts to try and stiffen the requirements and create even more mandates. So anyway, pretty much winding down here. I can never get through this stuff very quickly, but it was kind of an eventful term. Last year was largely dominated by responses to the police-involved shooting of Ari Faisal, which was resolved arguably with the inquest report in October. But anyway, we'll talk about this again at some future date. See you then.